Welcome back to Stock Talk, and for this month's edition we're actually going to do something a little bit different. We're going to look at specific stocks that stand out in various CPMS strategies.
Exactly. First up is Bank of Nova Scotia, which is currently held in 3 of our CPMS models.
Now Melissa, is it normal for one stock to be held in a couple portfolios?
It can definitely happen from time to time. In this circumstance, BNS actually qualifies for our conservative 10, dividend growth, and our predictable growth strategies. The idea behind it is they're actually all screening for very different variables. So in this circumstance, BNS is actually demonstrating stability and yield, but also very positive growth traits as well.
Okay, great. So we actually have Dan Werner on the line with us from Chicago. He covers BNS. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So Dan, I know you don't typically use CPMS in Chicago, but we were hoping you could provide us some insight since you cover BNS. So far, how are they doing this year?
Well, in an environment with low interest rates and which puts pressures on asset yields, they've done pretty. It looks like they're going to have a pretty good quarter so far. Typically, the Canadian banks have a good, strong first quarter, but in terms of their operating segments, the international and the Canadian personal commercial banking segments typically contribute about equal amounts of net income, and we still see that going forward for most of this year. Although you're going to see more growth on the international side, given that they're more in South American and Latin American countries, and with the increasing consumer debt in Canada and slowing housing market, we're probably going to see slower growth in Canada. But overall, on the positive side, we're going to see good wealth management income as well as good trading income from the capital markets groups.
Now, Dan, I know investors are very interested in the dividend story. Can you comment on the dividend of BNS with respect to other Canadian banks?
Yeah, typical Canadian banks pay out 40 to 50% of their net income in dividends. Bank of Nova Scotia typically is around that middle to lower end range, in the 40 to 45% payout range. And they've been very careful about increasing their dividends just to make sure that they maintain capital requirements as a result. For this quarter, I think we're going to see a little bit of a dividend increase, maybe 2 or 3 cents, which is pretty typical of most Canadian banks as they do it on a every other quarter basis. But compared to other Canadian banks, they're all kind of in the upper 40% range. So, Bank of Nova Scotia is pretty conservative with its dividend relative to the other banks.
Okay, and can you comment on the valuations of Bank of Nova Scotia versus the rest of the banking sector?
Well, unfortunately, everybody else sees how valuable a franchise Bank of Nova Scotia is, and it's currently trading at around our fair value estimate of $60 Canadian. It's trading at 11.7 times earnings and 2.7 times tangible book value, which is definitely on the high end of the group of Canadian banks. The only one higher would be Royal Bank, which is trading near 12 times earnings and nearly 3 times tangible book. So when its price is lower, it's definitely a value, but right now it seems to be pretty fully priced in our estimation.
That's great. Another important element to analyzing a company, obviously, is management and strategy. Dan, in your recent analyst report, you actually commented on the positive management strategy within Scotiabank. Can you comment on what might impress you the most here?
This is a company that keeps its costs very close to the vest, and they do a very good job with that. They keep a long-term view of the company's performance going forward. As a result, they only engage in small additive acquisitions. When they enter another country, they not only look at the possible financial aspects, but they also look at the geopolitical aspects and see if that's a country that they want to enter. So they've been very careful with their expansion. CEO Rick Waugh has been CEO since 2003, last 10 years. And during his tenure, the bank stock has appreciated 200%, and dividends have increased 144%, which is quite an enviable record among banks over that time period. Mr. Waugh is nearing retirement, and recently Bank of Nova Scotia promoted Brian Porter to the post of president. Brian Porter is the former head of international banking as well as the former chief credit officer. So obviously Scotiabank's management has a pretty deep bench, and they're getting ready to transition to Mr. Porter.
That's great. And Dan, Melissa and I were talking earlier, and BNS actually comes out with their quarterly earnings release on March 5th. So we wanted to know, what are your expectations for this?
You know, typically Canadian banks have a really strong first quarter, and I think we're going to see that from Bank of Nova Scotia as well. You know, we're going to see strong loan growth again for the first quarter in the Canadian personal commercial banking, and we're going to see a carryover from what we saw in the fourth quarter with strong trading income as well as wealth management income. The markets have done very well this first quarter, last 4 or 5 months, and that's going to be reflected in Bank of Nova Scotia's results, which will allow, with improved net income, will allow them to increase the dividend.
That's great. Thanks so much for joining us, Dan.
Thank you.